All right, so today we're going to deal with two figures, Hegel and Ritschl. I've referenced Hegel earlier, and Hegel is, as I mentioned, Hans Küng. I think it was Hans Küng, who's a 20th century Catholic theologian that you'll find out later in the book. I think he's the one who said that of all the notoriously difficult to understand German philosophers, Hegel is the most notoriously difficult. Now, Hegel is an extremely difficult person to understand, and many philosophies will build on him or what people think he is saying. Marxism builds off of Hegel. I think you could argue Darwinism does as well. And so I'm going to give you the generic perspective of Hegel. A couple years ago, I was watching some videos on a guy who was a Hegel scholar, and he said that all of these portrayals are wrong. So there's that caveat. If you want to go and research Hegel, be my guest. But he falls largely into philosophy, and he's kind of dealing with the philosophy of religion as well. So he's not a Christian theologian in the sense that we think about. He's kind of like Kant, where he's making philosophical statements that then theologians are going to piggyback onto. All right, so he's extremely important for that purpose, but he's extremely difficult to understand. So I'll give you the basic rundown. Hegel, as I mentioned in the last lecture, I think it was the last lecture, I was talking about how once you get rid of revelation as your grounding, as your anchor, well, then you're left with objectivity is subjective, which I know doesn't make any sense. But how do you know what truth is? How do you know what reality is if you don't have something to anchor it? Because all of a sudden you go from God revealing himself to now we are on our own. How do we know if there's a God, what he wants for us, what truth is? And so all of these German philosophers, like if you want to really study a bunch of really difficult stuff, just look at 19th century German philosophers. Holy cow. I mean, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. I mean, these people are like making they have huge impacts, but they're difficult to really grasp. So again, I'm giving you the standard view of Hegel, which again, once you do your own studies on Hegel, may or may not be true. So Hegel is looking at sociological governing structures through history. And his view is that you have a current view of how things work. Let's say tribalism. The strongest guy becomes in charge. And then it confronts a differing view, let's say something like, monarchy, right? Or maybe a tribe where it goes by birth, and then the two come together and they conflict, and then they conflate, and they become something new. So you would have something like tribalism would become something like monarchy, which would then become something like a republic, which would then become something like democracy, right? It's this ever increasing. He would say it's improving. It's an evolving. He wouldn't use that word, but if you think about how evolution works, which I think is building off of Hegel, he views reality as this form of evolution where you have people are improving, right? We have systems are improving and creating something better. Now, of course, for Hegel, who's living in Prussia, he believes that Prussia is the greatest of all these possible worlds. So this is basically God working through history to improve. So for him, God is an impersonal force that kind of works with us through history. All right. And the terminology that is used for this, he says you have the thesis, which is the current view of politics, religion, science. Then it has the antithesis, the something that argues against the thesis. The two take parts of each one and it forms the synthesis. Then the synthesis becomes the thesis, which then has a new antithesis. The two take parts of each other and become a new synthesis, which then becomes a thesis. So it's like a stair step. The best way, the analogy I use for this is Reese's. So if you're familiar with Reese's peanut butter and all of the candy bars, I use that as an example. Here's what I mean. The thesis is chocolate. It's confronted by the antithesis, which is peanut butter. The two merge together and create a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. But we're not done there, because then you have Crunchy Peanuts and Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. And they get together, and all of a sudden, so you have the thesis is the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, the antithesis is peanuts, and then the synthesis creates a Crunchy Peanut Butter Cup, which I don't know if they still exist, but they used to. Then you could take that and you could add caramel nougat to it. So the thesis is now Crunchy Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. The antithesis is nougat. The two get together and they create a Reese's Fast Break, which, if you're not familiar with those, very good candy bar, right? So now the thesis is the Fast Break, and we're going to put whole peanuts on top of that and a peanut butter filling, and that's the antithesis, and the two come together to make a synthesis of a Nutrageous, which, if you've never had a Nutrageous, best candy bar ever. All right, so that's the analogy I use. So where you went just from plain chocolate to now you have a Nutrageous. You have gone up the staircase of always improving on the original design. So for Hegel, that's a very positive view of reality, right? Things are getting better and better and better and better. And as you'll see in your book in a few chapters, World War I is going to ruin all of this, right? World War I, as terrible as it is, does a great job of destroying modernist theology. So remember, this whole book by Roger Olson is looking at modernism and the reactions to it, all right? Which, again, it's very deep. And if you've been reading it, it's not the easiest thing. I apologize for that, but again, it's the best I could find in dealing with modern things. And Olson is a great writer dealing with very difficult things. So I'm trying to take this and give you the most simplistic version of it. So Hegel's view will end up being used for religious purposes. So I'm going to jump over for a second into a guy by the name of F.C. Bauer. So Hegel is a philosopher. He would call himself a Christian, but he's an unorthodox Christian, right? His main concern is philosophy and reality, not Christianity. But Christians will take up on this. Now remember, last lecture, Schleiermacher redefines Christianity, right? It's not his goal. He wants to make Christianity more palatable to people, and in doing so, he ruins Christianity. He neuters it because he gets rid of all of the supernatural. You don't have to believe in miracles. You don't have to believe that Jesus is God and call yourself a Christian. Up until this point, you did. And this is why I said today you have whole denominations that you're like, I don't even think these people are Christians, but they call themselves Christians. Right. Thanks, Schleiermacher. If Schleiermacher hadn't done that, they would have just gone off and become pagans or something else. So what happens is F.C. Bauer is a German New Testament professor, and he takes the New Testament and basically runs it through Hegel's dialectic, is what that's called. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So Bauer does not believe in God. He's an atheist, right? Doesn't believe in miracles, doesn't believe in any of this. So he's wondering, well, how do we have this progression through Christianity if none of this is real? So what he does is he takes the history of the New Testament and Christianity and puts it into this Hegelian dialectic, to where you had Jewish Christianity then confronted Gentile Christianity, so Peter and Paul, and they create Catholic theology. Then Catholic theology will confront Arianism and create Trinitarian Catholic theology, right? So for for Bauer, none of this is based on reality. It's just reactions. So the Trinity is not real. We know it's not real. How do we know that? Because we know that there's no God. How do we know that? Because of science. We can't prove there's a God. See, that's what modernism has done. And so Bauer takes all of these views that Hegel has, this system, and applies it to the New Testament. It's going to go like that through Old Testament, through church history, through systematic theology. All of these parts of Christianity are now going to be put into this Hegelian dialectic by the Germans, right? The Germans are the ones who are doing all of this, and then it bleeds over into England and eventually into the US, but it always takes a while. So that's Hegel and Bauer. I did them quickly because I want to get to Ritschl. So Albrecht Ritschl, who is 1822 to 1889. I think he's around that time. Hegel is early 19th century. Ritschl's going to be for most of the 19th century. And Ritschl's going to have a profound impact. So Schleiermacher came in and, in my view, right, divorced Christianity from its history, right, from historical truth. Christianity is now a feeling of absolute dependence. And so what do you have then? If Christianity is not real, like if the miracles aren't real, if Jesus being God isn't real, then what can we do with Christianity? What's the point of Christianity at this point? And Albrecht Ritschl comes in, and I have some quotes here I want to quote from the book, and he's going to reduce Christianity to morals and ethics. All right, so let me get these things here from Ritschl. So here's some good. This is on page 148 from Olson, and let me just read a few. As a reminder and a refresher, liberal theologians, in the words of one of its contemporary proponents, agreed on the necessity of giving renewed strength and currency to Protestant Christianity by adapting it to the spiritual wants of modern man, even if much of the past had accepted without demur would have to be discarded, even if much of that past. So again, what they're saying is, modern people don't believe that Jesus is God. How can we make Christianity work for them? Is what the Protestant liberal theologians are doing. And it is called Protestant liberal theology. This is not making a political statement. This is not a conservative making comments about a liberal. This is what it is called in all standard textbooks. The rise of modern Protestant liberalism. Okay, that's what this is called. So, so Olson also says from about 1875 to 1925, Ritschlianism, which is following what Albrecht Ritschl teaches, was virtually synonymous with liberal Protestantism. So what is this? Okay, what is Ritschl saying? And what he says, here's a key thing that I've harped on when we talk about modernism. All right, so this is page 149. Ritschl believed the conflicts between religion and sciences were unnecessary and based on a misunderstanding. The failure properly to distinguish between two different kinds of knowledge. Scientific, by which he meant not only the physical sciences, but also the social sciences, that's a dangerous move, and religious. Scientific knowledge, he asserted, strives for pure, theological, disinterested, objective cognition of things in themselves, or at least as they appear, as in Kant's philosophy. Science attempts to grasp the inner nature of reality from a position of neutrality. Remember that. Neutrality. Religious knowledge, by contrast, consists of value judgments about reality. It interprets reality in terms of the value things have for the knower's ultimate fulfillment and moral well-being, right? Scientific knowledge can only be about the way things are, whereas religious knowledge is always about the way things ought to be. That is a phenomenal assessment. All right, that's on page 149, because that really cuts to the heart of liberal Protestantism. As you can see here, and as I mentioned before, modernism operates under the presupposition that knowledge is knowable from the senses. All right, so even here, Ritschl is thinking that science is neutral. Science is not neutral. All right, this is the problem that modernism had in the 19th century. And we're going to see Karl Barth is going to call it out in the 20th century. We're going to have some problems with Karl Barth. Right? When we get to Karl Barth, we're going to have some problems with him. But the thing Karl Barth does is he says, you're playing the wrong game. Why are you playing the game of modernism? Modernism and Christianity don't work together, right? He gets it. And it's going to take conservatives like till the 1980s to really understand this. So what happens is Ritschl thinks, well, science is science. How can you argue, right? If sodium and chlorine get together and create salt, and then the same guy tells me we've evolved from apes, this is true, right? This is science, right? Think of the presuppositions that takes. These people just will eventually, when we get to evolution, these people, well, the scientist says it must be true, right? That's it. That's their presupposition. That's the problem, because if science is true, and if science says that miracles don't happen, well, what do we do with the Bible? So Ritschl says, well, right, miracles aren't important. What's important is the moral teachings of the Bible. And he's bought into, again, what modernism has done because of Immanuel Kant. They've created a two-tiered system of knowledge. True knowledge that comes from science, and then religious knowledge, which is kind of implied. So for Ritschl, what he's concerned about is he has reduced Christianity to morality. How do we live? Ethics. And the problem, though, is when you start with that, what's your presupposition that these ethics are even right? Right? His presupposition is saying that you can reduce Christianity to ethics, but really, it's now subjective. Who's to say you're right in the ethics? Who's to say, right? When Jesus says, love your neighbor, why is that even true? If Jesus isn't even God, if God hasn't really revealed himself, so what? See, they don't think of that. And that's the way a lot of people today even think, right? Because we've built our whole Western system upon a Christian worldview, people think murder is wrong. But as you've seen in recent times here in the US, people say, if you believe X, then you're a Nazi. It's acceptable for us to kill Nazis, therefore we can kill you, right? I mean, you have people that will say that, all right? People who will say you can assault people that you disagree with because they're basically Nazis, and you kill Nazis because they're bad, right? That Christian, and again, based on their presuppositions, they're not wrong, because their presuppositions are, I'm an atheist, I just make up my own objectivity. So, and again, that's why you have some people that are confused, like, well, no, it's wrong to kill people, but then they twist what all of this means, right? So, Ritschl is important because he has reduced Christianity to ethics and morality. That's what you need to know about Ritschl. And what we're going to see is we're going to get to a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch who is going to do that in the US. And we're going to see what that looks like. And you're going to see that what it comes down to for Ritschl is loving your neighbor. What does that look like? Helping them get out of poverty. What about the gospel? Well, that is the gospel. What about redemption and reconciliation with God? No, that's not what's important. What's important is helping people. You see, and so they've removed the spiritual element, and that's going to have really bad consequences. And we'll see this with Rauschenbusch, and if you go over into the history of missions, you see this in the early 20th century where so many denominations only care about helping people get out of poverty, which is basically the Peace Corps, without any spiritual underpinning. And if you believe the gospel, what you've done is you've helped these people to have clean water and go to hell with clean water. Like, what difference does it make, right? If we understand there is a need for people to be made right with God, then you're doing a disservice if all you do is help them physically, right? Jesus healed people, helped their physical needs and their spiritual needs. And that's what Christians are supposed to do. When you get rid of that spiritual element, you're building just a really bad foundation. And so I'll give you an example, okay, and then I'll stop. I had a missions professor. He was a missionary in Cameroon. And this would be if you took Ritschl and took him to the 20th century, which is what the Peace Corps is. I don't think the Peace Corps claims to have any Christian background, but basically what they're doing is Ritschlianism in a modern setting. So there were people from the Peace Corps that had come to this village, and they had constructed a water pump. All right, so it would take water maybe 3 miles from the water hole to the village, so they didn't have to make that trek several times a day, which then arguably would give them more time to do other things, right? So they made the water pump, gave them instructions how to use it, told them how it works, and then left. A year later, they came back. The pump was all rusted, didn't work. And the people from the Peace Corps were confused. They're like, what happened? Like, we told you how to work the pump. You know, what happened to the pump? They said, oh, well, right after you left, the witch doctor told us that it upset the water spirit, so we didn't use it. And you see, spiritual battle, right? You told them what to do, but you didn't get rid of their underpinnings that allowed them to use it properly, whereas Christianity does. You see that a lot of times. There's great missionary stories where witch doctors will become Christians because they say, I tried every hex and spell I had on you and it didn't work, so I figured your God's more powerful than my God. So they become Christians, right? This is a spiritual battle, and we need to understand that. And when you remove the spiritual, you're doing a disservice. You're not going to get to the heart of the problem. And that's the problem with Ritschlianism, is ultimately it's just this veneer of Christianity without the spiritual depth, and it doesn't really help. So that's it for Ritschl, Hegel, and again, hopefully this will help as you read this to help make sense of it. And again, Hegel is extremely difficult to understand. They get into deep philosophical things. I really should try to read it myself. I'm just relying on what other people said. Everybody you talk to says Hegel, right? So I should do my own homework and do that. But I still have like Augustine City of God to read. I'm not going to read whatever phenomenology and reality, whatever it is that Hegel writes. So anyway, okay. So I'm grading your papers. Hopefully I'll have them done by tomorrow. And let me know if you have any questions.